The first time I saw her again after 50 years, I almost walked past her. She was standing outside a little coffee shop in Portland, Oregon, holding a paper cup in one hand and wearing a dark blue coat. Her hair was silver now, her face lined with age, but I knew those eyes immediately. They were the same eyes I had fallen in love with when I was 19. Her name was Evelyn Carter. My first love. The woman I hadn't seen since 1976. And there was one thing about her that made my heart stop. She was wearing my mother's wedding ring. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are listening in the comments. I wish I could tell you that seeing Evelyn again felt like something out of a romantic movie. It didn't. It felt like being hit by a memory I had spent half a century trying to bury. I stood across the street, completely frozen. For a moment, I was 19 again. I could almost smell the pine trees from my parents' backyard. I could hear Evelyn laughing beside my old pickup truck. I could remember the way she used to tuck her brown hair behind her ear whenever she got nervous. We had been inseparable that summer. Everyone thought we would get married. I thought so too. But then, one August morning, Evelyn disappeared from my life. No goodbye. No explanation. Just gone. I spent years wondering what I had done wrong. Eventually, I married someone else. I built a career, raised 2 children, bought a house, paid off a mortgage, and learned how to live with questions that never had answers. Then, at 71 years old, I saw Evelyn Carter standing 20 yards away from me. And she wasn't alone. An older woman was talking to her, but Evelyn wasn't paying attention. She was staring straight at the street. Straight at me. Our eyes met. Her face went pale. The coffee cup slipped from her hand and hit the sidewalk. Neither of us moved. Then she whispered something I couldn't hear. I crossed the street. Evelyn. She looked at me for several seconds before finally saying my name. Daniel. Hearing it from her nearly broke me. We talked for only a few minutes. She told me she lived nearby and had been in the area for several years. I asked the obvious question. Why did you leave? Her expression changed immediately. She looked down at the ring on her finger. That was when I finally got close enough to see it clearly. There was no mistaking it. A thin gold band with a tiny blue stone. My mother had worn that ring every day for 32 years. I remembered it because, after she died, my father had searched everywhere for it. We never found it. I stared at Evelyn's hand. Where did you get that? She didn't answer. Instead, she looked directly into my eyes and said something I'll never forget. Your mother gave it to me. I felt the world go strangely quiet. My mother died 23 years ago. I know. Then how could she have given you that ring? Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. Because, Daniel, she gave it to me long before she died. I couldn't speak. She reached into her purse, pulled out a small envelope, and placed it in my hand. There are things your mother never told you. Then she walked away. I stood there holding that envelope, staring at the woman I had loved 50 years earlier. And for the first time in my life, I wondered if the story I had been told about my own mother was a lie. I didn't open the envelope immediately. I stood outside the coffee shop for almost a full minute, watching Evelyn disappear around the corner. My hands were shaking. Not because I was afraid of what was inside. I was afraid of what it might prove. I slipped the envelope into my coat pocket and walked to my car. The drive home took 20 minutes, but I barely remember any of it. My mind kept going back to one sentence. Your mother gave it to me. My mother, Margaret, had always been a quiet woman. She rarely talked about her younger years, and whenever I asked about the period before she met my father, she'd simply smile and say, "There isn't much to tell." I had accepted that answer my entire life. Until that day. When I reached my house, I made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and placed the envelope in front of me. There was no name written on it. No date. Just my name. Daniel. The handwriting was Evelyn's. I opened it carefully. Inside was a single folded piece of paper. I expected a long explanation, Instead, there were only 3 sentences. Daniel, if you are reading this, then you finally know about the ring. But before you judge your mother, you need to know what happened the summer we separated. I read those words twice. Then a third time. My chest tightened. The summer we separated. She was talking about 1976. The summer Evelyn disappeared. I kept reading. I wanted to tell you the truth back then, but someone made sure I couldn't. That was it. No explanation. No name. Nothing else. I sat there staring at the paper. Someone. Who? My father. Someone in Evelyn's family. Or somebody I had never suspected. I immediately thought about my father. His name was Robert. He had died 12 years earlier, and although we had loved each other, there had always been certain subjects we avoided. Especially Evelyn. Whenever I mentioned her, Dad became uncomfortable. Once, when I was 30, I asked him what he thought had happened between us. He simply said, "Some people aren't meant to stay in your life." At the time, I thought he was giving me ordinary fatherly advice. Now I wasn't so sure. I went upstairs to the closet where I kept old family photographs and documents. My mother's belongings had been packed into 3 cardboard boxes after her death. I hadn't opened those boxes in years. I pulled the first one down. Old Christmas cards, my childhood report cards, photographs from my parents' wedding. Then I found something that made me stop. A photograph of my mother from 1976. She was standing beside a lake. And beside her was Evelyn. I had never seen that photograph before. But that wasn't the strangest part. Written on the back in my mother's handwriting were 6 words. She knows what really happened. I stared at the photograph for several seconds. Then I turned it over again. Evelyn had been standing beside my mother only weeks before she disappeared from my life. So why had my mother never told me they knew each other? And what exactly did Evelyn know? I reached for my phone. I was about to call her when it rang. It was Evelyn. I answered. She didn't say hello. She whispered, "Daniel, don't look in your father's old desk." Then the call ended. I sat completely still, because my father's old desk was sitting in my garage. And suddenly, I was terrified of what I might find inside it. What if the one place Evelyn warned me never to search was exactly where my father had hidden the truth for 50 years? I waited until the next morning before I touched my father's desk. I don't know why I waited. Maybe some part of me was hoping that after a night's sleep, everything would feel less real. It didn't. The photograph of my mother and Evelyn was still sitting on my kitchen table, and those 6 words on the back kept running through my mind. She knows what really happened. I carried the desk out of the garage and placed it near the window. It was an old oak desk my father had bought shortly after they moved into our first house. I'd seen him sitting behind it countless times, writing checks, paying bills, and keeping documents that he never wanted anyone else to see. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are listening in the comments. I ran my fingers along the top and remembered something strange. My father had always kept one drawer locked. Even when I was a kid, that drawer was off-limits. I found the old key taped underneath the desk exactly where he'd always kept it. My hands were unsteady as I unlocked it. Inside were tax documents, old insurance papers, receipts, and several envelopes. Nothing looked unusual at first. Then I found a small brown envelope with my mother's handwriting on it. My name was written across the front. I opened it carefully. Inside was a newspaper clipping dated August 1976. The headline was about a young woman from our town who had left suddenly after a family dispute. There was no photograph, but the name underneath the article made my stomach drop. Evelyn Carter. I read the article 3 times. It said Evelyn had left town to stay with relatives in California. According to the article, she had planned to remain there indefinitely, but there was something my father had underlined in blue ink. One sentence. Family members declined to comment on the circumstances surrounding her departure. I kept searching through the drawer and found another envelope. This one contained a handwritten note from my father. It was dated 2 days before Evelyn disappeared. The note said, Daniel can never know what happened between Margaret and Evelyn. Some truths destroy more than they heal. I felt my throat tighten. Margaret, my mother, Evelyn, what could possibly have happened between them? I continued searching until I found a folded piece of paper tucked beneath an old bank statement. It wasn't my father's handwriting. I recognized it immediately. It belonged to Evelyn. There were only 4 lines. Margaret promised me she would tell Daniel everything. She promised she would stop him from leaving with his father, but when the time came, she changed her mind. I read that sentence again. Then I heard a noise behind me. Someone had opened the garage door. I turned around and saw Evelyn standing there. She looked frightened. She stared at the papers in my hands and whispered, "You weren't supposed to find those yet." I stood up slowly. "Find what, Evelyn? What were you and my mother hiding from me?" She looked toward my father's desk, then back at me. "Daniel, your mother wasn't trying to keep us apart." Her voice trembled. "She was trying to protect you." I felt my anger disappear. "Protect me from what?" Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. "From the man who raised you." And suddenly, every memory I had of my father began to look different. For 50 years, I believed my father had simply accepted that Evelyn was gone. Now I was beginning to wonder if he had been the reason she disappeared in the first place. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. I was staring at Evelyn, trying to understand what she had just said. "The man who raised you?" I finally asked. "What does that mean?" Evelyn looked at the old desk behind me. "It means your father wasn't the man you thought he was." I felt a strange chill move through me. I had spent 71 years believing Robert Harris was my father. He taught me how to drive, took me fishing, helped me buy my first house, and sat beside me when my children were born. Whatever his faults were, I had never questioned whether he loved me. "Are you telling me my father wasn't my father?" I asked. Evelyn shook her head. "No. I'm telling you that there are things about your birth that your mother never had the courage to tell you." I stepped closer. "Then tell me now." She looked away. "I promised your mother I would wait until you were ready." I almost laughed. "I'm 71, Evelyn. If I'm not ready now, I never will be." She gave me a sad smile. "That's exactly what Margaret used to say." Hearing my mother's name made the anger inside me soften. I wanted answers, but I also knew Evelyn wasn't going to give me everything at once. She walked over to the desk and picked up the old newspaper clipping. "Your mother gave me this," she said. "She told me to keep it somewhere safe." "Why?" "Because she knew your father would destroy it if he found it." I looked at her. "What was he trying to hide?" Evelyn took a deep breath. "The truth about why your mother almost left him." That stopped me. My mother had never mentioned leaving my father. In every family photograph, they looked happy. They celebrated anniversaries, traveled together, and even held hands when they were older. "When did she try to leave?" I asked. "In 1976. The year Evelyn disappeared. I suddenly understood why that summer had always felt so important in my family's history. Evelyn continued, "Your mother had decided to tell you something before she left. But your father found out. And what did he do?" "He confronted her." "Did he hurt her?" Evelyn shook her head quickly. "No, not physically." She hesitated. "But he gave her a choice." "What choice?" She looked directly into my eyes. "She could leave with you and lose everything, or she could stay and keep you." My stomach tightened. Why would leaving mean losing me? Evelyn didn't answer. Instead, she reached into her purse and pulled out another photograph. This one was older, much older. It showed my mother standing beside a young man I had never seen before. On the back was a date from 1954 and a name. I read it aloud. "Thomas." Evelyn nodded. "That's the man your mother loved before your father." I stared at the photograph, confused. "What does some man from 1954 have to do with me?" Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. "Everything, Daniel." She turned the photograph over again and pointed to a handwritten sentence beneath the name. "Your mother wrote this herself." I read the words slowly. "Thomas was the only man I ever loved before Robert." Then Evelyn whispered, "And your father spent his entire marriage afraid you would discover why." I thought I was searching for the reason Evelyn had disappeared from my life. I had no idea I was about to uncover a secret about my own family that had been buried for more than 70 years. I couldn't take my eyes off the photograph, Thomas. The name meant nothing to me, yet somehow it felt like the missing piece to a puzzle I had been carrying my entire life without realizing it. I looked at Evelyn and asked, "Who was he?" She sat down slowly in the chair beside my father's desk. "Thomas Reed was your mother's first love," she said. "They met when she was 17. They were together for several years and everyone in town thought they would marry. I swallowed hard. But they didn't. No, your mother ended it. Why? Evelyn looked at the photograph again. Because she found out she was pregnant. My heart stopped. I stared at her. Pregnant, she nodded. With you, I couldn't speak. The room suddenly felt too small. For 71 years, I had believed Robert Harris was my biological father. There had never been a reason to question it. My birth certificate carried his name. My childhood photographs showed him holding me. My mother had never suggested otherwise. You're saying Thomas was my real father? I finally asked. Evelyn didn't answer immediately. I'm saying your mother believed Thomas was your father. That distinction confused me. Believed? Evelyn looked nervous. Your mother never knew for certain. I stood up. How could she not know? Because by the time she realized she was pregnant, she had already started seeing Robert. I walked toward the window, trying to process everything. My entire identity suddenly felt uncertain. I thought about my childhood, my father's dark eyes, my mother's soft, brown hair. I had always looked different from both of them. My siblings had joked about it when we were young, saying I must have been adopted. My mother would laugh and tell them, Daniel just has his own face. I had never questioned it. Evelyn continued quietly. Thomas left town before you were born. Your mother tried to find him, but she couldn't. Robert knew about the pregnancy. He offered to marry her and raise you as his own. That sounds generous, I said bitterly. It was, Evelyn replied. At first, she reached into her purse and pulled out a folded letter. But years later, your mother discovered something that changed everything. I opened the letter. It was from Thomas. The date was 1955, months after my birth. The message was short. He had apparently returned to town and asked Margaret to meet him. At the bottom he had written, "If the boy is mine, I deserve to know." My hands started trembling. Did he ever meet me? I asked. Evelyn shook her head. No. Why? She looked at me with tears in her eyes. Because Robert made sure he never got the chance. I stared at her. What did my father do? Evelyn reached for my hand. He told Thomas you weren't his son. And Thomas believed him. He had no reason not to, she paused. But your mother did something your father never expected. She kept proof. I looked down at the letter again. What proof? Evelyn's voice became almost a whisper. A photograph, a hospital record, and a letter your mother wrote the night you were born. Then she looked at the wedding ring on her finger. That's why she gave me this. I had spent my entire life thinking that ring belonged to my family. Now I was beginning to understand that it might have been carrying a secret about my birth all along. I looked at the ring on Evelyn's finger again, but this time I saw it differently. It wasn't simply my mother's wedding ring anymore. It was evidence of a secret that had survived longer than most of the people involved. Where is the proof? I asked. Evelyn hesitated. Your mother gave it to me because she was afraid Robert would destroy it. So you have it. Not all of it. Her answer made my heart sink. What happened to the rest? Evelyn looked toward the garage door. Some of it was lost when I left town. I wanted to believe her, but after everything I had just learned, trust wasn't easy anymore. Evelyn, you've had 50 years to tell me this. I know. Why didn't you? She looked down at her hands. Because your mother made me promise. I stared at her. Why would she make you promise to keep something like this from me? Evelyn took a slow breath. Because she thought telling you would put you in danger. The word stopped me. Danger from my father? She nodded. Your father wasn't violent, Daniel, but he was powerful in ways you didn't understand when you were young. He had friends in town, business connections, and a reputation people respected. Your mother believed that if she challenged him, he could make your life very difficult. I sat down across from her. Then why give you the ring? Evelyn touched the gold band gently. Because she knew she might not live long enough to tell you herself. I looked at her. When did she give it to you? 3 weeks before she died. That answer surprised me. My mother had died peacefully in her sleep at 84. Her death had been unexpected, but the doctors said her heart had simply become too weak. What exactly did she say? I asked. Evelyn looked directly at me. She told me that if you ever found out about Thomas, I was supposed to give you the ring and the truth. But you only gave me the ring. Because I needed to know whether you were ready for the rest. I shook my head. Ready, I said. I'm 71. Age isn't what makes someone ready, Daniel. Sometimes it's what you're willing to lose after you learn the truth. Her words stayed with me. Then she reached into her purse again and removed a small photograph. It showed my mother sitting on a hospital bed. She looked young, exhausted, and frightened. In her arms was a newborn baby. Me, On the back, in her handwriting, were the words, "My son, born from a love I was forced to bury." I couldn't breathe for a moment. "Where did you get this?" I asked. "Your mother gave it to me. And the hospital record? I know where it is." My heart started racing. "Where?" Evelyn stood up. "In the basement of the old house where your mother lived before she married Robert." I frowned. "That house was sold decades ago." "I know," she reached for her coat, "but I also know the new owner." Before leaving, she stopped at the door and looked back at me. "Daniel, there's something else you need to understand. Finding out who your biological father was is only half the truth." I waited. "The other half explains why Robert was so desperate to keep Thomas away from you." I thought I was searching for my biological father. I didn't realize I was getting closer to the reason my own father had spent decades hiding the truth, and that reason was connected to the woman standing in front of me. The next morning, Evelyn picked me up just after 9. I hadn't slept much the night before. I kept thinking about the photograph of my mother holding me as a newborn and the words she had written on the back. "My son, born from a love I was forced to bury." Those words had changed the way I saw my entire childhood. Evelyn drove us toward the outskirts of town, where my mother's old house had once stood. I remembered the place from childhood visits. It had been a small white house with a porch and 2 maple trees in the front yard. My mother used to tell me she had lived there before meeting my father, but she never talked about those years. When we arrived, the original house was gone. A modern 2-story home stood in its place. An elderly man named Walter opened the door after Evelyn knocked. "Evelyn," he said, surprised, "I haven't seen you in years." She introduced me. Walter looked at me for a moment, then his expression changed. "You're Margaret's son," I nodded. "You knew my mother?" "Very well," he said. "She used to come here after your father bought the house." I exchanged a glance with Evelyn. "My father," Walter nodded. "Robert came here once." His voice became quieter. "He wasn't happy." We stepped inside. Walter led us to a small storage room at the back of the house. "Your mother left a box here years ago," he explained. "She told me never to open it unless you came looking for it." My heart began pounding. "Why didn't you contact me?" Walter shook his head. "Because she specifically asked me not to." He opened an old wooden cabinet and pulled out a dusty metal box. My name was written on the lid. I lifted it carefully. Inside were several documents, 2 photographs, and a small envelope sealed with red wax. Evelyn immediately recognized it. "That's her handwriting." I picked up the first document. It was a hospital record from 1955. My mother's name was listed as Margaret Collins. Under the section for the child's father, there was something unusual. The name had been crossed out. Beneath it, someone had written unknown. "Who crossed this out?" I asked. Walter looked uncomfortable. "Your father." I stared at him. "How do you know?" "Because I saw him do it." My hands went cold. "You were there." Walter nodded. "Robert came to the hospital the day after you were born. Your mother was still recovering. He had a conversation with the doctor." Evelyn stepped closer. "What did he say?" Walter hesitated. "He said that if Thomas Reed ever came looking for the child, he wanted the hospital to deny that Thomas was the father." I felt anger rising in my chest. "Why would he do that?" Walter looked at me sadly. "Because Thomas wasn't just your mother's old boyfriend." He pointed to the second photograph. I picked it up. It showed Thomas standing beside Robert. They were much younger. I stared at their faces. "They knew each other," I whispered. Walter nodded. "They were business partners." Evelyn suddenly covered her mouth. "Oh my God!" I turned toward her. "What?" She looked at the photograph, then at me. "Your mother never told me this." Walter slowly opened the sealed envelope. Inside was a letter dated 3 days before my birth. The first line made my blood run cold. "Robert, if you are reading this, then you already know that Thomas is coming back for his son." For the first time, I realized this wasn't simply a story about 2 men fighting over a woman. There had been something much bigger behind my parents' marriage, and I was beginning to suspect I had been at the center of it from the day I was born. I held the letter so tightly that the edges began to bend. I looked at Walter, then Evelyn, and finally back at the first line. "Robert, if you are reading this, then you already know that Thomas is coming back for his son." My mouth went dry. "Why would my mother write this to my father?" Walter didn't answer. Evelyn stepped closer. "Read the rest." I unfolded the letter carefully. The handwriting was unmistakably my mother's. "Robert, I agreed to marry you because you promised me you would protect Daniel until Thomas returned. You said you understood that he was Daniel's father and that you would never stand in the way of them knowing each other, but I know you have changed your mind. I stopped reading. My heart was pounding. My father had apparently known about Thomas from the beginning. I continued. Thomas made mistakes, but he never abandoned his son. You know why he left. You know what happened between the two of you, and you know that if Thomas tells Daniel the truth, everything you built could disappear. I looked up. What happened between them? Evelyn shook her head. Keep reading. The next paragraph was shorter. I will not allow you to use Daniel as punishment against Thomas. If you refuse to let him meet his son, I will tell Daniel everything myself. My hands trembled. Then came the final sentence. And if anything happens to me, Evelyn knows where I left the evidence. I lowered the letter slowly. Evidence of what? Evelyn looked at Walter. I think we finally know why your mother gave me the ring. Walter nodded. But there's more in the box. I looked inside again. Beneath the letter was a small black and white photograph. It showed 3 men standing outside what looked like an old warehouse. One was my father. The second was Thomas. I didn't recognize the third. On the back, my mother had written a name, Frank Dalton. I stared at it. Who is Frank Dalton? Walter's expression changed immediately. You don't know? No. He was Robert's closest business associate. Evelyn took the photograph from my hand. And what happened to him? Walter sighed. He disappeared in 1976, the year Evelyn left, the year my mother almost left my father, the year Thomas supposedly came back looking for me. Suddenly, the timeline began fitting together in a way that frightened me. Was Frank involved with Thomas? I asked. Walter nodded. All 3 men were involved in a business deal that went terribly wrong. Evelyn looked at me, and your mother discovered what they had done. I felt a chill. What had they done? Walter hesitated before answering. Money had gone missing. A lot of it. I looked down at the photograph again. Are you saying my father stole money? Not exactly, Walter said. Your father was accused of stealing it. By whom? Thomas. I felt my stomach tighten. For 50 years, I had believed Thomas was simply the man who broke my mother's heart and disappeared. Now I was learning that he had accused my father of something serious. Before I could ask another question, Evelyn suddenly noticed something inside the box. She reached underneath the documents and pulled out a small brass key. My mother's handwriting was engraved on a paper tag attached to it. For Daniel, only after you know about Frank. I looked at Evelyn. What does this open? She stared at the key for several seconds. Then her face went pale. I think I know. The key wasn't for my mother's old house. It belonged to a place I had visited hundreds of times as a child, a place my father had forbidden me to enter after dark. And if Evelyn was right, the truth about Thomas, my father, and the missing money had been waiting there for 50 years. Evelyn refused to tell me where the key belonged until we were back in my car. She sat quietly in the passenger seat, turning it between her fingers. Finally, she looked at me and said, Do you remember the old marina your father used to take you to? I immediately did. It was on the river, about 15 minutes outside town. My father had owned a small storage building there for years. As a child, I wasn't allowed inside. He always told me it contained business equipment and nothing a kid would find interesting. The warehouse, I said. Evelyn nodded. That's where your father kept records. We drove there without saying much. When we arrived, the marina looked almost exactly as I remembered it, except everything seemed smaller now. The old warehouse stood near the water, its paint peeling and its windows covered in dust. The lock on the side door was rusted, but the brass key fit perfectly. My heart started pounding. Are you sure we should do this? I asked. Evelyn looked at me. Your mother wanted you to? I unlocked the door. Inside, the air smelled of old wood and oil. Sunlight came through cracks in the roof, revealing rows of shelves filled with boxes. I walked slowly toward the back. Memories came rushing back. I remembered my father bringing me here when I was 8. He had told me to wait outside while he spoke to a man named Frank. I had forgotten about that until now. Daniel, Evelyn whispered. Look. She was pointing at a metal filing cabinet. One drawer had a label attached to it. RH, 1976. I pulled it open. Inside were invoices, bank statements, contracts, and several handwritten notes. Then I found a folder with Thomas's name on it. I opened it and discovered copies of financial records. Thomas had accused Robert of transferring money from their business account into another company, but the account wasn't in Robert's name. It belonged to Frank Dalton. I looked at Evelyn. So Frank stole the money? Maybe, she said. But why would my father be involved? I kept searching. Beneath the financial records was a letter from Thomas to Robert. It was dated July 1976. I know what you did, it began. If you don't return the money, I will tell Margaret everything. I read the next line and froze. And I will tell Daniel the truth about his father. I lowered the letter. Thomas was threatening him. Evelyn nodded. Yes. Then why did Thomas disappear? She looked toward the river. Because someone made sure he couldn't keep his promise. My heart raced. Who? She didn't answer. Instead, she pointed toward another folder. Inside was a police report about Frank Dalton. I read it carefully. Frank had been reported missing on August 17, 1976. The same week, Evelyn disappeared, but there was one detail that made my blood run cold. The report listed the last person known to have spoken to Frank, Robert Harris. I stepped backward. My father had always told me he barely knew Frank. He had lied. Then I found a second report underneath it. This one was about Thomas Reed. It had been filed 3 days later. Thomas had also disappeared. I looked at Evelyn. 2 men vanished within days of each other. She nodded slowly. And your mother knew why? Before I could read further, something crashed against the warehouse door. We both turned. Someone was standing outside. And then a man's voice called my name. Daniel, you really should have left this alone. I had spent 50 years believing the people from my past were gone forever. Now someone was standing outside my father's warehouse, warning me to stop searching, and whoever it was knew exactly what I had just found. The voice outside the warehouse was older, but there was something familiar about it. I couldn't place it. Evelyn grabbed my arm and whispered, "Don't open the door." I moved closer anyway. "Who are you?" I called. There was a long silence. Then the man answered, "Someone who knew your father better than you ever did." My heart began pounding. Evelyn looked terrified. "Daniel, we have to leave." I nodded, but before we could move, the door handle turned. Someone was trying to get inside. I quickly looked around the warehouse and spotted a small side exit near the back. We ran toward it, carrying the folder and the old documents with us. As soon as we stepped outside, we heard the warehouse door crash open behind us. We didn't stop until we reached my car. I locked the doors and started the engine. Evelyn was breathing heavily. "Who was that?" I asked. "I don't know," she said. "You knew that voice." "I thought I did." She looked out the window, "But I can't be sure." I drove several miles before pulling into a quiet parking lot. I spread the documents across the dashboard. The police report about Frank Dalton was still there. So was the report about Thomas. "There has to be a connection," I said. Evelyn nodded. "There is." She reached into her purse and pulled out another envelope. "Your mother gave me this years ago. She told me not to open it unless someone came looking for the documents. Someone just did." She handed it to me. Inside was a letter dated September 1976. It was from Thomas. The first sentence made me stop breathing. "Margaret, if Daniel ever learns the truth, tell him I never abandoned him." I continued reading. Thomas explained that he had returned to town because he wanted to meet his son. He had planned to take Daniel to court and establish paternity, but before he could do anything, Frank approached him. Frank claimed he had evidence that Robert had stolen money from their business. Thomas agreed to meet him privately. According to the letter, Thomas never returned from that meeting. I looked at Evelyn. "So what happened to him?" She shook her head. "We don't know." I continued reading. The final paragraph was even more disturbing. Thomas wrote that if anything happened to him, Margaret should protect Daniel from Robert because Robert believed Thomas was going to expose everything. Then came a sentence that changed everything. "Robert knows that Daniel isn't his only problem. He knows what Margaret saw that night." I stared at the words. "What did my mother see?" Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. "I think she saw what happened to Thomas." Before I could respond, my phone rang. The number was unknown, I answered. No one spoke for several seconds. Then a man's voice said, "You found Thomas's letter, didn't you?" I froze. "Who is this?" The man ignored my question. "Your mother wasn't supposed to keep that letter." "What do you want?" I demanded. His voice became colder. "I want you to stop looking for answers that should have stayed buried." Then he hung up. Evelyn stared at me. "Daniel." "What?" She pointed at the envelope. "Look at the date." I checked it again. September 1976. Then I noticed something I hadn't seen before. The letter wasn't written by Thomas. The signature had been forged. For 50 years, I thought the mystery began with Evelyn leaving me. Now I knew it began much earlier, and someone had been manufacturing evidence to make sure I never discovered the truth. I stared at the signature at the bottom of the letter until the words blurred in front of me. "This isn't Thomas's handwriting," I said. Evelyn shook her head. "No, it's not." I had never met Thomas, but I had seen his handwriting on the older documents we'd found. The letters were rounded and slightly slanted. The signature on this page was sharper, almost mechanical. Someone had copied it. "Then who wrote this?" I asked. Evelyn didn't answer. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small magnifying glass. "Your mother taught me to look for details," she said, "especially when something doesn't make sense." She placed the glass over the signature. There were faint pencil marks beneath the ink, as if someone had practiced the letters before writing over them. "This was forged," she whispered. I leaned back against the seat. "But why would anyone forge a letter from Thomas? To make your mother believe he had abandoned you." That explanation hit me harder than I expected. If Thomas had never written the letter, then someone had deliberately created a story that he had disappeared without caring about me. I looked at Evelyn. "Who had something to gain from that?" she answered immediately. "Robert." I didn't want to hear it. "My father raised me." "I know. He loved me." "I know that too." "Then why would he do this?" Evelyn looked out the windshield. "Because love and fear can exist in the same person." Her words reminded me of my father in a way I didn't want to admit. Robert had always been protective of me. Sometimes too protective. When I was 17, he had destroyed a letter from a girl I was dating because he thought she was a bad influence. When I was 22, he warned me not to ask questions about Thomas. I had assumed it was because he didn't want me chasing an old family story. Maybe it had been something else. I folded the letter and placed it back inside the envelope. "We need to find the original." Evelyn nodded. "Your mother believed there was another letter." "Where?" "She never told me." I thought about the boxes from my father's desk. Then I remembered something. "The attic." Evelyn looked at me. "What about it?" "My mother kept a cedar chest up there. She never let anyone open it." We drove home immediately. The attic was dark and dusty, filled with Christmas decorations, old furniture, and boxes I hadn't touched since my children were young. At the far end stood the cedar chest. I lifted the lid. Inside were blankets, photographs, and several dresses my mother had kept from her younger years. Beneath them was a small wooden box. It had no lock. Inside were 3 letters tied together with a faded blue ribbon. The first was from my mother to Evelyn. The second was from my father to my mother. The third had no envelope at all. I unfolded it carefully. The handwriting made my heart stop. It was Thomas's. This time there was no doubt. The letter began, "Margaret, I know you think I left because I didn't want Daniel." "That isn't true." I read faster. Thomas explained that he had been preparing to return to town and take a paternity test. He wanted to prove he was my biological father and finally tell me the truth. But he had discovered that Robert and Frank were planning to leave town with the business money. Thomas threatened to expose them. Then came the line that made my hands tremble. "If I disappear, it won't be because I left you. It will be because they made sure I couldn't come back." I looked at Evelyn. "This is real." She nodded through tears. "Yes." I turned the page. The final paragraph contained one name. "Daniel must never trust Frank's son." I frowned. "Frank had a son?" Evelyn's face suddenly went pale. "Yes." "What's his name?" She didn't answer. She simply stared toward the attic stairs. A floorboard creaked below us. Someone was inside my house. I had finally found a letter written by the man who might have been my biological father. But his warning had opened a new mystery. Frank Dalton's son was still alive, and someone had just entered my home looking for the same evidence I had spent 50 years without knowing existed. Evelyn and I froze at the sound of the floorboard downstairs. For a few seconds, neither of us moved. Then I quietly closed the cedar chest and held the letters against my chest. "Stay here," I whispered. Evelyn grabbed my arm. "Absolutely not." We moved toward the attic stairs together. The house was silent again. I could hear the old wall clock ticking in the hallway below. I took one step down, then another. When I reached the bottom, I saw the front door standing open. I knew I had locked it before leaving that morning. "Someone was here," I whispered. Evelyn looked around the living room. Nothing appeared disturbed. Then I noticed something on the kitchen table. A photograph. I hadn't left it there. I picked it up. It was an old picture of my father standing outside the warehouse with Frank Dalton. Someone had circled Frank's face in red ink. On the back were 4 words, "Ask his son." I turned toward Evelyn. "You said Frank had a son." She nodded. His name was Michael. Where is he? I don't know. After Frank disappeared, his wife moved away with Michael. They changed their last name. I looked at the photograph again. Do you know what name they used? Evelyn hesitated. Miller. My stomach tightened. Michael Miller. She nodded. I immediately remembered the name. A man named Michael Miller had worked at the bank in our town for nearly 20 years. I had met him several times. He had attended my father's funeral. He had even shaken my hand and told me how sorry he was for my loss. That's impossible, I said. Michael Miller is here. Evelyn stared at me. Are you sure? I know him. I reached for my phone and searched through my contacts. There he was, Michael Miller. The realization made my skin crawl. If Frank's son was still living in town, he had been around me for years. Perhaps he'd known exactly who I was. I called him. He didn't answer. I left a message asking him to call me back. Then I noticed another detail on the photograph. There was a small mark in the bottom corner, a symbol I didn't recognize. Evelyn did. That's Frank's old business logo. What does it mean? It was used on the warehouse records. I remembered the files we'd found. Several documents had the same mark. Suddenly, I wondered whether the missing money had ever really been about money. Maybe it had been something else. Evelyn looked at the letters in my hands. Your mother knew more than she told me. I nodded. And she left clues. I unfolded the second letter, the one written by my father. It was addressed to my mother and dated August 1976. The first line made my stomach twist. Margaret, you were right about Thomas. I read on. Robert admitted that Thomas had discovered something about Frank. He also admitted that he had tried to convince Thomas to leave town, but Robert claimed he hadn't hurt him. He wrote that Thomas had disappeared after meeting Frank at the warehouse. Then came another sentence. I swear I never knew what Frank planned to do. I stopped. My father had been afraid of Frank too. Maybe Robert wasn't the mastermind. Maybe he had been trapped in something he couldn't control. Before I could read further, my phone rang again. This time Michael Miller was calling. I answered. Michael. There was silence. Then he said, Daniel, I was hoping you would never find those letters. My heart dropped. You knew about them. I've known about them for a very long time. Then tell me what happened to my father. Michael's breathing became heavy. Your father, I corrected myself. Thomas Reed. He was silent for several seconds. Then he said, my father didn't kill Thomas. I gripped the phone tighter. I never said he did. Michael lowered his voice. You don't understand. Someone else was there that night. Who? He hesitated. Your mother. For 50 years, I had believed my mother was the woman who tried to protect me from the truth. Now I was beginning to wonder if she had been the only person who actually knew what happened that night, and why she had taken that secret to her grave. I couldn't speak after Michael said my mother's name. I looked at Evelyn, who had heard every word through the speaker. Her face had gone completely pale. What do you mean my mother was there? I asked. Michael took a long breath. I mean exactly what I said. Margaret was at the warehouse the night Thomas disappeared. How do you know that? Because my father told me. I gripped the phone tighter. Your father disappeared 50 years ago. When did he tell you? He told me everything before he died. And you waited all these years? Michael's voice became quieter. I was 16 when he told me. I didn't understand what it meant. By the time I did, everyone involved was already gone. I looked at Evelyn. Where is Michael now? She whispered. Keep him talking. I asked him what his father had told him. Michael hesitated before answering. Frank said Robert and Thomas had been arguing about money, but the money wasn't the real problem. Thomas had discovered that Frank had been moving company funds into private accounts. Robert knew about it, but he didn't know how much had disappeared. Then why was Thomas meeting Frank? Because Thomas wanted to expose him. Michael paused, but Robert was afraid Thomas would expose him too. I felt my stomach tighten. What did my father do? He asked Thomas to give him time. And Thomas refused. Yes, I looked down at the old photograph. So where does my mother fit into this? Michael's answer came slowly. Margaret discovered the missing money before either man realized she knew. She confronted Robert. What happened? She threatened to leave him and take you with her. I closed my eyes. That matched everything Evelyn had told me, but there was more. Michael continued. The night Thomas disappeared, Margaret followed Robert to the warehouse. My heart started racing. Why? Because she thought Robert was going to meet Thomas. Did he? Yes, Michael said. The two men argued inside. Frank was there too. Margaret stayed outside until she heard shouting. She went inside and saw Thomas on the floor. I felt a cold sensation move through my chest. Was he dead? No, Michael's voice dropped. He was alive. I looked at Evelyn. Then what happened? Michael said. Frank wanted to finish it. Robert stopped him. I stared at the phone. That didn't fit the story I had imagined. My father might not have been the villain after all. What happened next? I asked. Margaret stepped between them. Michael explained that she begged Robert to call the police, but Frank threatened both of them. He told Robert that if the police came, he would make sure Daniel never learned the truth about his birth. Your father panicked, Michael said. He helped Thomas escape through the back door. Where did Thomas go? That's the part nobody knows. Michael paused. Frank followed him. My hands were shaking now, and my mother, she went home with Robert. Why didn't she tell anyone? Because Frank threatened to hurt you. I looked at Evelyn. Tears were running down her cheeks. That's why she stayed, she whispered. Michael continued, but your mother wasn't finished. She secretly collected documents proving what Frank had done. She gave copies to someone she trusted. Who? I asked. Michael was silent. My mother, I frowned. Your mother? Yes, Frank's wife. I felt completely lost. Michael told me that his mother had kept the evidence hidden for decades because she feared Frank might return. Then he said something that changed everything. Daniel, there's one thing my father told me that I've never told anyone. What? Thomas didn't disappear that night. I held my breath. He survived. Michael's voice trembled, and he contacted your mother years later. I stared at Evelyn. She looked as shocked as I was. When? I asked. Michael answered with 4 words. The year she died. For 50 years, I believed Thomas Reed vanished in 1976. Now I knew he had survived. And if Michael was telling the truth, my mother had known where he was until the very end. I couldn't move after Michael said those 4 words. The year she died. My mother had died 23 years ago. If Thomas had really contacted her that year, then there was a possibility that she had spent her final days knowing exactly where the man she once loved was. I looked at Evelyn. Did you know Thomas was alive? She shook her head slowly. No. Margaret never told me. I turned back to the phone. Michael, where is he? There was a long silence. I don't know, he finally said, but I know where he was. Tell me. A town in Washington called Port Townsend. The name meant nothing to me. Michael explained that his father had received a letter from someone there shortly before his death. The letter contained a photograph of an older man who looked remarkably like the young Thomas from my mother's photograph. Do you have the photograph? I asked. Yes. Can I see it? Not over the phone, he paused. Meet me tomorrow morning, I agreed. After the call ended, Evelyn sat quietly beside me. Daniel, there's something you need to know before you meet him. What? She looked at the ring on her finger. Your mother didn't give me this ring because she wanted me to protect a secret. She gave it to me because she wanted me to protect you. I frowned. From what? From the possibility that Thomas would come back into your life. I stared at her. Why would she be afraid of that? Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. Because she didn't know whether he was the same man who left 50 years ago. I didn't understand. You said he never abandoned us. That's what we believed. She took a deep breath. But your mother received letters from him for years. At first they were loving, then they changed. Changed how? They became angry. Thomas blamed her for staying with Robert. He blamed her for keeping you from him. He wanted answers. I felt a knot form in my stomach. Did she ever meet him again? Once. I stared at her. When? 6 months before she died. I thought about my mother's final year. She had seemed different then, more withdrawn. She spent hours in her bedroom writing letters. Whenever I asked what she was doing, she said she was organizing old memories. I had assumed she was preparing her things. Maybe she had been doing something else entirely. Evelyn continued, Your mother told me after that meeting that Thomas had changed. She said the man she remembered was gone. What did he want? He wanted the ring. I looked at the gold band on her finger. Why? He believed your mother had promised it to him. I frowned. But it was her wedding ring. Not originally. Evelyn slowly removed the ring and placed it in my palm. Look inside. I turned it toward the light. There were tiny initials engraved on the inside that I had never noticed before. TR. My heart stopped. Thomas Reed. Your mother told me Thomas gave her this ring when they were young, Evelyn said. She wore it before she ever met Robert. I stared at the initials. Suddenly, the title of my mother's life seemed to be sitting in my hand. The ring had never belonged to Robert. It had belonged to Thomas. My mother had eventually worn it as her wedding ring with another man, carrying a secret no one understood. "Why did she give it to you?" I asked. Evelyn's voice broke. "Because when Thomas came back, your mother was afraid he would take it." "Take it?" "Yes," she looked at me, "and because she knew that if you ever discovered the ring, you would eventually discover him." I couldn't stop staring at the engraving. Then I noticed something else. Inside the band, beneath Thomas's initials, was a tiny number, 17. I showed it to Evelyn. Her face changed immediately. "That's not a date," she whispered. "It's a room number." "Room number for what?" She looked toward the old photograph of my mother and Thomas. "The hotel where they first planned to run away together." I felt my heart pound. "Where?" Evelyn swallowed. "Port Townsend." The ring had led me to Thomas. Thomas had led me to my mother. And now the same ring was pointing me toward the exact town where he may have disappeared, and where, 50 years later, someone might still be waiting for me. The next morning, Evelyn and I drove toward Port Townsend before sunrise. Neither of us talked much during the first hour. I kept the ring in my pocket, wrapped in a small cloth, as if carrying it openly might somehow invite another piece of the past into my life. I couldn't stop thinking about the number 17 engraved inside it. A hotel room. A plan to run away. A love story that had supposedly ended 50 years ago. Yet every road we followed seemed to lead back to the same two people, my mother and Thomas Reed. When we finally reached Port Townsend, the town looked peaceful. Old buildings lined the waterfront, small shops were opening, and fishing boats moved slowly across the harbor. It was hard to imagine that a place this quiet could hold the answers to a secret that had haunted my family for decades. Michael was waiting for us outside a small bookstore. He looked exhausted. "You came," he said. "You said you had something I needed to see." He handed me an envelope. Inside was a photograph. I recognized the face immediately. An older man stood beside a wooden house overlooking the water. His hair was white, his shoulders were thinner, but his eyes were unmistakable. They were the same eyes I had seen in my mother's photograph. "Thomas," I whispered. Michael nodded. "This was taken 2 years ago." My hands trembled. "Where is he now?" Michael looked at Evelyn before answering. "He died last winter." The words hit me harder than I expected. I had spent days believing I might finally meet the man who could explain my entire life. Now I had missed him by months. "Did he leave anything?" I asked. Michael handed me another envelope. "This was meant for you." My name was written across it. I stared at the handwriting. It matched the letters we'd found. Thomas had written it shortly before his death. I opened it. "Daniel, if this letter has reached you, then Margaret is gone, and you finally know that I never abandoned you." My eyes filled with tears. He explained that after the night at the warehouse, he escaped with the help of Margaret. He had wanted to return immediately, but Frank had threatened to hurt her and me. Thomas left town to keep us safe. For years, he tried to contact my mother through letters, but she was afraid Robert would discover them. Eventually, Thomas built a new life in Washington. He married, had children, and became a grandfather, but he never stopped wondering about me. Then came the sentence that broke something inside me. "I saw you once when you were 23. I stopped reading. "What?" Evelyn whispered. I continued. Thomas had traveled back to our town secretly. He saw me outside my father's business, laughing with a group of friends. He wanted to approach me, but Robert was standing nearby. Thomas wrote that he realized he could not risk destroying my life. He left without introducing himself. "I was right there," I whispered, "and he was watching me." Evelyn put her hand on my shoulder. The letter continued. Thomas explained that before his death, he contacted my mother one final time. They met in a small cafe. He asked her why she had never told me the truth. Margaret cried and said she was afraid I would hate her. Thomas told her that he never hated her. He only regretted losing 50 years. Then he gave her one final instruction. "If Daniel ever finds the ring, tell him to look beneath the floorboards of room 17. I looked at Evelyn. "The hotel," she nodded. Michael suddenly stepped forward. "There is one problem." "What?" "The hotel doesn't exist anymore." I felt my heart sink. "Then why did Thomas leave that clue?" Michael pulled out an old map. He pointed toward the waterfront. "Because the building still exists, it's just not a hotel anymore." We drove there immediately. The old building had been converted into private apartments. Room 17 was now an apartment on the second floor. We knocked, but nobody answered. Then I noticed something on the floor near the doorway. A small envelope had been pushed underneath the door. My name was written on it. I picked it up. Inside was a single photograph of my mother standing outside that same building in 1976. On the back were 7 words. She came here the night Thomas disappeared. For 50 years, I had believed my mother was the woman who kept Thomas away from me. Now I was standing outside the place where she had secretly met him, and someone had left me a photograph proving she was there on the very night everything changed. I stared at the photograph for several seconds before looking at Evelyn. "This can't be right," I said. "My mother told me she was home that night." Evelyn took the photograph from my hand and examined it closely. "It's real," she whispered. The date was written on the back, and there was no doubt about the year. 1976. I looked at the apartment door again. Room 17. The same number engraved inside the ring. "Someone wants me to find something here," I said. Michael nodded. "But who?" Before anyone could answer, the apartment door opened. An elderly woman stood there, looking at us suspiciously. "Can I help you?" she asked. I showed her the photograph. Her expression changed immediately. "Where did you get that?" "It belonged to my mother," I replied. She stared at me for a long moment before opening the door wider. "Come inside." The apartment was small and old-fashioned. The woman introduced herself as Margaret Lawson. When I told her my mother's name, she became emotional. I wondered if someone from her family would eventually come looking. My heart started racing. "You knew her?" Margaret nodded. "I was living here in 1976. Your mother came to this building several times. Why?" "To meet a man." I didn't need to ask who. "Thomas," she nodded. "But there was another man, too." My stomach tightened. "Robert?" "No, Frank Dalton." Evelyn stepped closer. "What did you see?" Margaret sat down slowly. "The night Thomas disappeared, your mother came here carrying a small suitcase. Thomas was already inside. Were they leaving together?" "That was the plan." I felt a strange mixture of sadness and anger. My mother had been prepared to leave my father with me. "Why didn't they?" Margaret looked at me. "Because Robert arrived." I closed my eyes. "What happened?" "They argued. Your mother begged Robert to let her go. Thomas told him that he would expose everything. And Frank? He arrived later." Margaret's voice became quieter. "He brought 2 men with him." I felt a chill. "Why?" "They were there to frighten Thomas." She paused. "But things got out of control." "What happened?" "There was a struggle. Thomas was injured, but he managed to escape through the back stairwell." I looked at Evelyn. "Then what happened to my mother?" Margaret said. "She stayed behind." "Why?" "Because Robert threatened to take you away forever." My chest tightened. "Did he have the legal power to do that?" "He threatened to make it happen." I realized then that my mother's silence hadn't necessarily been weakness. She may have believed she had no choice. Margaret pointed toward the floor. "Before Thomas left, he hid something beneath the floorboards." My heart started pounding. "What?" "I don't know. He told your mother it was proof." She looked at the wooden floor near the window. "Your mother returned the next morning and asked me to help her retrieve it." Evelyn whispered. "Did she?" Margaret shook her head. "No." "She changed her mind." "Why?" "Because Robert was watching the building." I looked down at the ring. "Then where is the evidence?" Margaret pointed toward the floorboards. "Still there, I believe." She handed me an old key. "Your mother gave me this before she left." I knelt beside the floor and noticed a loose board. My hands trembled as I lifted it. Beneath it was a metal box covered in dust. I pulled it out. There was no lock. Inside were bank records, photographs, and one final document. It was a paternity test dated 1976. I looked at the result. Thomas Reed was confirmed as my biological father. But underneath the result, someone had written one sentence in red ink. "Now ask why Robert still wanted Daniel." I had finally discovered the truth about my birth, but the paternity test answered only one question. The more frightening question was why my father had fought so hard to keep me, even after knowing I wasn't his son. I stared at the paternity test until the words stopped looking real. Thomas Reed was my biological father. There was no uncertainty anymore. After 71 years, I finally knew where I came from. Yet instead of feeling relieved, I felt an emptiness I couldn't explain. I looked at Evelyn. "Why did Robert keep me?" She didn't answer immediately. Margaret Lawson was standing behind us, quietly watching. Finally, she said, "Because your father loved you." I shook my head. "That doesn't explain everything." "No," Evelyn said softly. "It doesn't." She pointed toward the documents inside the metal box. "Keep looking." I picked up a stack of bank records. Most were from 1975 and 1976. At first, they looked like ordinary business transactions, but then I noticed something strange. Several payments had been made into an account under my name. The account had been opened when I was only 2 years old. "What is this?" I asked. Evelyn leaned over the documents. "Robert created a trust for you." "Why?" I turned another page. The total amount shocked me. It was more money than I had ever imagined my father having. "Where did this come from?" Margaret looked uncomfortable. "That's what Thomas was investigating." I searched through the papers and found a handwritten note from my mother. "Daniel, your father never wanted your money. He wanted you to have what belonged to you." I looked at Evelyn. "What belonged to me?" She shook her head. "Read the next page." The next document explained that Thomas had invested money into a small business before I was born. Frank had secretly diverted part of the profits. When Thomas discovered the missing funds, he wanted to expose Frank. Robert became involved because he had signed some of the business documents. He wasn't the thief, but he had covered up the problem to protect the company and his reputation. Thomas had threatened to reveal everything. That explained why Robert was afraid, but it didn't explain why he kept me. Then I found another letter. This one was from Robert to my mother. "Margaret, I know Daniel is Thomas's son. I have known since the hospital, but I don't care. He is my son because I raised him. I won't let Thomas take him from me." I stopped reading. For the first time, I saw my father differently. He had lied. He had manipulated the truth. He had made terrible choices. But maybe he hadn't done them because he didn't love me. Maybe he had done them because he loved me too much and was terrified of losing me. The letter continued. "If Thomas wants his money, he can have it. If he wants revenge, he can have that too, but he will not take Daniel." I felt tears forming in my eyes. Evelyn placed a hand on my shoulder. "Your father wasn't innocent," she said, "but he wasn't the monster you thought he was." I nodded slowly. Then I noticed another document beneath the letter. It was dated only 6 months before my mother's death. My mother had written a final statement confirming everything we had discovered. At the bottom, she had added one sentence. "Daniel deserves to know that both men loved him, but neither man knew how to love without hurting someone else." I folded the statement carefully. Then Evelyn removed the wedding ring from her finger and placed it in my palm. "Your mother wanted you to have this." I stared at the tiny initials inside. "TR. Why did she give it to you instead of me?" I asked. Evelyn smiled through tears. "Because she knew you would need to find the truth before you could understand what the ring meant." I closed my fingers around it. 50 years ago, I had lost Evelyn because of a secret I didn't understand. Now she was standing beside me, still wearing the ring that had brought us back together. I looked at her and asked the question I had been afraid to ask since the day we met again. "Evelyn, after everything we've discovered, why did you come back into my life?" She smiled sadly. "Because your mother asked me to." My mother had been planning our reunion long before either of us knew it would happen. But if she had brought Evelyn back into my life for a reason, I had to know what that reason was. And the answer would finally explain why she had kept one last secret from both of us. I looked at Evelyn, waiting for her answer. "Your mother asked me to find you," she said quietly. "But she never told me when. She only said that if the right moment ever came, I would know." I felt tears building in my eyes. What was the right moment? Evelyn reached into her purse and pulled out a final envelope. It was old, but the handwriting was unmistakably my mother's. My name was written across the front. I opened it with trembling hands. "Daniel, if Evelyn is giving you this letter, then you have finally learned the truth. I know you will probably be angry with me. I know you may wonder why I kept so much from you. The answer is simple. I was afraid. I was afraid of losing you, afraid of Robert, and afraid that the truth would destroy the life I had worked so hard to give you." I stopped reading for a moment. My mother had always seemed strong to me. I had never imagined how frightened she must have been. I continued. "Thomas was your biological father, but Robert was the man who stayed. Neither fact changes the love you received. I made mistakes. Robert made mistakes. Thomas made mistakes, but you were never a mistake." I wiped my eyes and kept reading. Then came the part I wasn't expecting. "As for Evelyn, I want you to understand something. I never blamed her for leaving. I knew she was forced to go. Robert believed he was protecting you, but he didn't understand that protecting someone from the truth can become another kind of prison." I looked at Evelyn. She was crying silently. My mother continued, "If you and Evelyn meet again, don't let the past decide your future. 50 years ago, you lost each other because other people made choices for you. Don't make the same mistake twice." I lowered the letter. For several seconds, there was only silence. Then Evelyn reached for my hand. "I loved you when we were young," she said. "I never stopped wondering what might have happened if we'd been given a choice." I smiled sadly. "I wondered too." She looked at the ring in my hand. "Your mother wanted me to wear it until you were ready." I looked down at the tiny initials, TR. The ring had belonged to Thomas, then my mother, and eventually Evelyn. Somehow it had carried all three stories through decades of silence. "You can keep it," I told her. She looked surprised. "Are you sure?" I nodded. "It doesn't belong to the past anymore." She smiled. "Then what does it belong to?" I looked at her. "To whatever comes next." We left the apartment together that afternoon. There were no dramatic promises and no impossible plans. We were both too old to pretend that life could be rewritten, but we could choose what happened next. We returned to Portland, visited my mother's grave, and I placed a small photograph of her and Thomas beside her flowers. I finally told her everything I had learned. I told her I forgave her. I told my father, too, in my own way. Because after all those years, I understood something I hadn't understood at 19. People can love you deeply and still make terrible choices. The important thing is what you choose to do when you finally have the chance to choose for yourself. A few months later, Evelyn and I sat together at the same little coffee shop where we had first seen each other again. She was wearing the ring. I reached across the table and held her hand. 50 years, I said. She smiled. Better late than never. I spent most of my life believing our love story had ended in 1976. I was wrong. Sometimes life doesn't give you a second chance because the past deserves to be changed. Sometimes it gives you one because, after all those years, you're finally ready to understand what love was trying to teach you. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.